everyone to this public lecture. Honorable Chairperson for KCHR, Professor K.N. Ganesh, Honorable Director, Professor Dineshan Vadakanil, respected Speaker, Dr. Mohamed Shafeeq, distinguished scholars, and my colleagues. Today, we have a wonderful and fruitful academic session by Dr. Mohamed Shafeeq on the topic, The Archives in a Borderland. Dr. Mohamed Shafeeq is working as Associate Professor at Manipal Center for Humanities, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Besides the monograph, The Gulf Migrant Archives in Kerala, Reading Borders and Belonging, his contributions to the field include chapters in the Oxford Handbook of Modern Indian Literatures, the Routledge Companion to Migration Literature, and numerous academic and mainstream publications. After the completion of this event, I'm sure that you all will feel enriched with knowledge on this particular topic. Before we start the session, all the audience are requested to keep their microphones on mute during the session. After the session, we will have a question and answer session. The questions can be typed in the chat box and we will read them out for the convenience of the speaker. If you still have any concerns about typing, you can ask the questions directly. For this purpose, you just click on the raise hand option. We will read your name accordingly. I feel honored to welcome you all once again for this webinar. Unfortunately, our director, Professor Dineshan Vadakanil, is unable to actively participate in today's session. I request Professor K.N. Ganesh to kindly take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Professor Mohamed Shafeeq. And I think, as usual with my so-called position as the chairperson, I am sitting in a chair and I request Professor Shafeeq to actually present his paper. Whatever comments I have, I'll comment it towards the end. You can start.
Thank you, KCHR, for this wonderful opportunity to share my work. So thank you everyone in the team involved who has been working on this, helping me work on this in the meanwhile. I hope you can all hear me, yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I have a PowerPoint to share. I'll be sharing it now.
You are audible.
Yeah. I will be reading out my paper. The PowerPoint is here now. All right. So I'll be reading out my paper. A story. I'll begin with a story. So a story I have heard of the Gulf migration goes like this.
Hello.
Yes. Hello. Hello.
No talk.
Is everything okay? Can I speak?
Class and that. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, this is a story that I've heard, which is that on the first departure of her son to the Gulf, the mother of the son yearned to God, "My God, let nothing happen to my son." Decades later, the son was exactly as he started out, which is to say, poor. The son remained poor. God did not let anything happen to him. This piece of black humor operates on the common sense that one is supposed to get rich in the Gulf. It also acknowledges that Gulf is a place where things happen to you. That Gulf is an adventure. One of the intriguing readings of Benjamin's Ardjividam was how the novel opens, how it was critically received as the novel that opens a window to the life in the Gulf, that it is full of hardship. It was intriguing for me on two counts. One, the novelist, by the novelist's own admission, this was a very rare account. Najib's story is a very unusual one. But secondly, whoever did not know life in the Gulf was hard, that it was laid with traps, that it had death as a possibility in its way towards life. To my mind, the answer is that Benjamin has now put to realist prose, and supposedly, if one is to go by the frame of the novel as it was told by a real life Najib, of course, we know the controversy around the film, without any fluff or sugarcoating. We knew stories of the Gulf for long, but realism was not the genre one could adopt for it. All of them, the stories of the Gulf, were stuff of the fantastic, like the exaggerated figure of the dearly loving Arab, or the mercilessly cruel Arab, or the overly shrewd migrant, or the migrant who had found a treasure. The many skeletons that lay in the desert, because that land was not amenable to the realism of our cause and effect laws. But we knew. Of the 1980s, Robin Jeffrey, studying the Kerala model of development, would write that Gulf migration held the promise of social transformation, the kind of promise that politics seemed to put forward in 1940s in Kerala. Jeffrey would also detail Gulf migration as a break between occupation and remuneration, coupled with an ignorance of the whole situation on the part of the public in Kerala. This is what he writes. People will do overseas where the neighbors cannot see them what they would not do at home. Just as the early migrants to Ceylon sometimes worked as menials, today examples are deplored or celebrated of the graduate of the Kerala University who works in Saudi Arabia as a head load worker in a construction firm. What is important is that he sends home a handsome amount. End quote. Here, the scare quotes within the quote such is the bit where Jeffrey is quoting from a newspaper. So clearly, as can be seen from the quote, Jeffrey knows the truth. So does the newspaper. At the same time, this knowledge comes with its own disavowal. One does not know. The performative of knowledge ignorance is therefore an abiding characteristic of the Gulf migration in Kerala. It has to perform an ignorance while also knowing fully well. It has to also perform the eruption of that knowledge as well as its repression. It has to perform knowledge as in ignorance, a knowing ignorance. This performative has to be seen in the context of the determining conditions that make the Gulf migration peculiar. The overseas is both a place beyond the sight of the neighbors as well as a place where what you do is known and deplored or celebrated. Migration invisibilized one's actual work. The exchange value of the Gulf currencies in India, combined with the wage differential, meant that the migrant could now accumulate luxurious goods around him. As the surveys show, the proportion of luxurious and very good houses is much higher among households with an immigrant or return immigrant in Kerala. Similarly, houses with immigrants, again, surveys show, are more likely to possess consumer durables such as television, refrigerator, phones, and motorcycles. How are we to account for this consumerism? To appreciate this consumerism, one should read it back to the formation of a Malayali identity as an identity that would bring together many communities beginning from the late 19th century. The idea was to display a new sensibility, and this was displayed through means of one's clothing and surrounding. To surround oneself with objects that one has understood to be of high cultural value was not therefore just an index of economic mobility, but also to suggest one's acknowledgement of modern sensibility, and hence a bid to invisibilize one's caste or community particularity. Thus, cultural citizenship became something that could be and is to be demonstrable through objects one had around oneself. Cultural citizenship, being as it was demonstrated through one's performance, could be mimicked, for example, by wearing white and white. The mobility that the Gulf promised made it an identity that had much social currency. The fact that the Gulf money could buy not just house, but also the performance of respectability made the figure of the Gulf migrant a source of fantasy. In the 80s, this would give rise to films like Akkere in 1984, Akkere Ninnorumaran 1985, Ponnutta Idunna Rajavu 1988, where being the Gulf migrant was the only way in which one could be a good husband. But precisely because this identity is not a stable one, because you could always lose your job in the Gulf, because it is always understood to be a face of your life, one always had to perform the Gulf. The invisibility of production could also be read as the unavailability of a public discourse to speak about labor. The fact that the only way in which one's profession could break into the public sphere through unionization was not a possibility in the case of the Gulf migrants, because migration essentially did not fit into the existing logic of unionization, which is premised upon the fit between upon the now unraveling fit between the worker and the citizen. Migration brought about a break in this fit in that it divorced citizenship from labor. One belonged somewhere and labored elsewhere. The invisibilization of the Gulf can therefore be read as the deprivation of a public language of rights to speak about the Gulf. While the Gulf migrant was seen as a source of riches, enviable or abhorred in Kerala, the migrant occupied a very different reality in the Gulf. What makes the migration to the Gulf countries different from the other targets of Kerala economic migration is the impossibility of any hope of being citizens one day in the countries of the Arabian Gulf. The migrant to the Gulf cannot think of permanently settling in the Gulf. He or she is not allowed to think so, nor was it a part of their imagination. The temporariness of the migrants is ensured through a labor contract system known as the kafala. This is a system in which the migrant laborer has to have a native sponsor. The migrant is bound to his or her sponsor. What it practically means is that he or she cannot change jobs or go back without the approval of the sponsor. Often, though it is against the law now, the migrant might even have to surrender his or her passport to the sponsor. At the hands of a merciless sponsor, the migrant laborer might end up in precarious state, working with no salary. The system of kafala is part of the Gulf policy making in place to ensure that the large foreign workforce currently dominating the national labor markets remains strictly temporary. This is a quote from Zahra Babar's work. So this system is designed such that it keeps the lowest of migrants marginalized, but also prevents, through a system of national and linguistic segregation, any possibility of transnational solidarity. Race plays a part in the kind of job one gets, the wages one can expect, the part of the city one lives in, or even the ways in which one negotiates the roads in visa regime and avenues of entertainment and leisure one has at one's disposal. Most companies, I quote, are careful to draw labor from a variety of regions, for these linguistic, national, cultural, and ethnic differences help build a fragmented and more docile workforce, a workforce with less ability to organize and strike, end quote. This is from Andrew Gardner's work. We also know that from Tristan Bruslet's work on Nepali migrants, that at dormitory level and often at canteen level, the division among migrants is based on nationality. So not only do divisions of language, class, and hierarchies thereby established within the migrants, but the fault lines from elsewhere also gets carried to the Gulf. The continuities between home and Gulf, established because of circular and temporary migration, also means that the migrant mind is not a tabula rasa from which new solidarities can emerge. Migration also draws its own lines of separation, the ones between the migrant and the non-migrant being just one of them. However, the perversity of the system of kafala ensures that migrant is not a bound entity separable from the oppressive system. A lot of people, labor brokers, middlemen, the sponsor, and even the state stands to gain by the perpetual precarity of the migrant. The existence of middlemen undermines any easy binarization of the native and the migrants, and it brings forth the porousness of community boundaries. As Neha Vora puts it, I quote, without the large number of expatriate employers and managers in the Gulf, the kafala system of migration sponsorship that underpins Gulf economic and political systems would not be able to function as it does. End quote. The kafala system itself may be understood as a regional variation of a global condition under contemporary capitalism. Andrew Gardner, for example, notes that the kafala system is a local variant of the deportation industry that is there elsewhere. Similarly, Andrea Wright illustrates how the conditions of kafala are part of the neoliberal labor policies rather than any cultural eccentricity of the Arab states. The conditions of kafala as well as the segregation of labor were drawn up by the transnational oil corporations in the middle of the 20th century and only subsequently attached to the stability of Gulf monarchies. The kafala system, with its retinue of middlemen, means that the yet to be migrant is yet one more chip to be cast into the business. The earlier migrant preys on the just arrived migrant. The system gives rise to a discourse of insecurity and victimization. The insecurity of the migration involves the imagined or real betrayal by someone close to oneself, like a friend or one's wife. The migrant community's insecurities are thus not always from an already defined outside. It is not always from the natives or other migrant communities or the state. The the betrayal can often happen from very intimate bonds. The outside and the inside, the hostilities and solidarities do not have predetermined contours, concerns, or targets. The circular migration that is enforced by the state policies of the Gulf countries, combined with the active participation of the migrants in the running of the exploitative system, mean that any binary of the migrant and the non-migrant has to be mapped onto a shifting scale. When the outside and the inside are not easily perceptible, public speech takes a new form. Gossips and rumors produce contradicting knowledges about the Gulf. Some of these contradictions can be seen as driving the fascination for migration. Both the migrant and the ones at home accuse each other of pleasures that one is denied. The temporariness of migration goes round in a comic and cruel circle. Kerala and the Gulf become the fantasy land for each other for their own lacks. The one back in Kerala associates the migrant with the wonders of the world. The migrant, on the other hand, associates the one staying back at home as someone who is privileged to be staying back at home, someone who can continue to enjoy the natural beauty bestowed on one's homeland, doesn't have to work every single day without taking a day off, just so that one can afford to spend a couple of months at home, and one who can partake of the general benefit, including those very gadgets brought in by the migrant who has to use a local expression, turn his sweat into blood by working in the Gulf. The peculiar genres of speaking about the Gulf, such as the place of gold and riches, or the rumors and gossips that characterize the social transformation, such as the person who who finds a treasure, could then be read as the performative through which the Gulf pervades the public sphere as a place of many possibilities, but in a private genre that refutes authority. One could introspect if it is owing to such a double life that Gulf could not really be the public social transformative force, even when it brought about spectacular transformation in families and neighborhoods and the state itself. As much as one recognizes the affective contours of the gossips and rumors that cannot be reduced to what can or cannot be talked about in the public domain, the book, my book also wagers that the silence that had characterized the Gulf migration and the revelations of the Gulf associated thereof is an instance of cognitive borders put in place by global capitalistic conditions, as I have explained so far. The private nature of the Gulf in the public discussions in Kerala has much to do with the depoliticization of the public sphere on the question of livelihood that characterizes, and this is a general characteristic of governmentality, but it also is refracted as affect. This particular impossibility of speaking about the Gulf in the public is refracted as, in a public genre, is refracted as affect, matters of pleasure and trust, envy and insecurity. It has to do with local forms. The form of rumor and gossip also has to do with local forms of knowledge and discussion beyond the state, which cannot find space in the rational public domain. The book finds Kerala and the Gulf to be borderlands where the migrants among themselves and in relation to non-migrants are divided by epistemic fault lines. As far as the book is concerned, a border is where different epistemes coexist and struggle against each other. Borrowing from Thomas Nail's theory of border, one could say that not only are borders not set in stone, they are also not impermeable. Borders are selective enactments of possibility and opacity. And since they are possible, the borders are also not at the edge, but in between, as something that divides rather than something that marks the absolute end of anything. As a process, the border does not merely include and exclude, but also recirculate and is therefore in between rather than at the edge, is in motion, and it can be permeable or can it in itself be moved. And it cannot be, just to summarize, and it cannot be reduced to a space. To speak about epistemic borders, therefore, is to discern enactments of epistemic opacity and passibility. To study Kerala as a borderland is also to move away from the constriction of the idea of border to those dividing nation states. It is to study Kerala as one of the regions in which the intensification, diversification, and heterogenization of labor, caught as it is in global capital, produce political, economic, and cognitive borders. Here, the book draws majorly from Border as Method, the book by Sandro Mezzetra and Brett Nielsen. The expansion of the frontiers of capital with regions replacing nations as its significant economic unit, the divorce between jurisdiction and territory effected due to carving out of special zones, and variation in applicable labor codes, the factoring of ethnicity, gender, political status, etc., in the labor process have all led to heterogenization of labor. In effect, multiple borders along political, economic, and cognitive axes characterize the abstract labor today, which the living labor has to negotiate. Today, I quote, borders are instrumental in producing space, labor power, markets, jurisdiction, and a variety of other objects in ways that converge on the production of subjectivity. End quote. The borderland is characterized by communities of gossip, rumor, and revelation, which have a communal existence and provide space for exclusive belonging and pleasure. The epistemic borders are therefore structural to the operations of late capitalism. Once we recognize the centrality of borders to late capitalism and the struggles against it, we see that there is a dialectic process at work between the capitalist border reinforcements on the one hand and the border struggles on the other. But precisely because the idea of the border is not correspondent to the idea of nation state anymore, one should also move away from positing the state as the theater of the struggles. Rather, in the very disjuncture between territory, nation, and jurisdiction, the border struggles find themselves to be operating locally. Inasmuch as it consists of resisting the border struggles are about devising new forms of coming together, the horizon of intelligibility or the scale of operation of which does not fit with that of the state. This particular act of building a horizon of intelligibility is called translation. So here, which is again a concept that is taken from Mezzadra and Nielsen, they do not understand translation as the replacement of codes of one established language with another. For them, the paradigm of translation is the co-creation of language that happens between foreigners, and therefore, suits the condition of borders. Naoki Sakai's distinction between homolingual and heterolingual, basically homolingual translation, which assumes homogeneous language communities, and heterolingual translation, which assumes heterogeneity in language. So basically, this is the theoretical apparatus for this notion of translation. To illustrate this, they refer to the creations of Creole on slave ships, where Creole did not belong to any particular language and was actually come through as a process between foreigners who speak different languages. The language that is created out of the condition that mirror modern labor force, which does not originally belong to any of them. It is that activity through which one's untranslatability becomes the source for a continual process of translation. Thus, rather than seeing untranslatability as the end point of translation from where one has to turn back, one must see it as the starting point. Moreover, it is the untranslatability that is one's singularity. Rather than think of the singularity as that which is to be overcome in the eventuality of successful translation, singularity is to be thought of as that point of discontinuity that makes translation an ongoing process. As is clear, the idea of translation is not premised on the arrival at a final stage of transparency in which all singularities have vanished. Rather, the idea of translation is premised on bordering itself along the various axes which will continue to produce discontinuities. The opacity that is cast on the gulf and the staging of bringing the other side to light, a characteristic of the Gulf migrant archives, is read as part of this translational relation, which erects borders, some conspicuously staged and others stealthily operationalized, as well as the struggles against borders in an act of articulating common destinies. The paradigm of border brings to the fore the need to study the publics, the intimate publics, the counter publics, recognizing that the very condition of border gives rise to pleasurable bonds, but also makes the inside and outside of these bonds tentative and unstable. Borders give rise to binaries incapable of dialogue, of non mutuality of speech, but also uncanniness of sounds and gestures. Borders are spaces and processes marked by the breakdown of public speech, the cleavages of rumors, the doublespeak under surveillance, and the hesitancy of confidence thanks to the looming figure of the informer. Studying the border, therefore, demands that we be sensitive of the inconsistency of characters, the fluidity of speech, the arresting of signifiers before they could turn into meanings, and the congealing of affect around the quotidian. As a method, what this has practically involved is the isolation of elements in a story, in photograph, in film, which would attest to selective enactment of passability and opacity across media and genre. So the book studies a host of media. So it studies literature, photography, films, but it also studies genres like realism, fantasy, etc. So what the book does is to isolate elements that give rise to niche and exclusive meanings, which then construct the gulf as a meaning that can be enjoyed as if in a private mode, as if in rumor or doublespeak, even as the media, like this literary piece or this photograph, it retains its ability to dissolve such a meaning. This has meant that the book does not involve analyzing novels or films in its entirety, And its choice of primary materials has been based on exemplarity. That is basically the contradiction involved in outstanding as an example. In the rest of this talk, and I think the time permits it, yes, I shall demonstrate an example of this from the book. So in this photograph, taken in Abu Dhabi in 1981, we see two men shaking hands with each other. The distance between them and the stretch of the hands suggests that they are unknown to each other. These are two strangers meeting in the city. Behind them, the newly constructed corniche, which took a few years to construct, behind them, the newly constructed corniche stretches to infinity. The broad walk by the sea, lined by streetlights, clearly convey that this place belongs to the city and developed world. It is a violet-toned photograph with deep composition. While the two men occupy the space closer to the foreground, a lonely figure in white kandura is visible towards the background, while the bright sea, the shaded corniche, and the dark, undefined boulders meet at the vanishing point where the walkway meanders to the right. The two men are dressed impeccably. They are wearing shiny black shoes. Their shirts are stylish. What could this photograph of a real space, rendered fantastic, tell us about migrant self-representations? The reading of this photograph requires us to see it for its intermediality. The photograph is caught with movement that it is rightly to be considered a freeze frame rather than a photograph. In its form, the shot of the photograph is closer to Malayalam film's depiction of the city as a space of crime, thrills, and adventure. The beginning of the 1980s saw a few Malayalam movies that were set in foreign locations. For example, Eram Kadalinakkare, which is set in the US, Vilkan Undu Swapnangal, which was set in Dubai, Love in Singapore, set in Singapore, America, set in the US, Mandanmar, London, set in the UK, Iniyangilum, which was set in Japan, etc. Yerang Kadalinakkare begins with the premise of two migrant laborers to the US, one a driver and the other a nurse, but soon turns into a narrative of casinos and chases and killings, and aligns with the gangster film genre, with considerable chunk of the screen time dedicated to the wonders of the first world. America, which was directed by Ivy Shashi and stars Mammootty, is completely set in the US and shot mainly in Florida. This film is whodunit around the murder of the captain of a ship. And Yerang Kadalinakkare is a like Yerang Kadalinakkare, it is a veritable procession of the marvels of the first world. High rises, digital hoardings, long glitzy cars, seaplanes, disco bars, a black muscle man whose signature stunt move reminds one of Muhammad Ali, etc. According to Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema, this definitive Malayalam hit, America, established the combination of star Mammootty and director Shashi. End quote. Love in Singapore, shot mostly in Singapore, shares the same grammar as these other movies, with its high rises, rooftops with views, shopping malls, etc. The plot follows the investigation around a relic stolen from Kerala and taken to Singapore. The investigating officer from Kerala, who is not the person you see on this, in the slide, meets his long lost brother in Singapore. So this is the brother. It is a reiteration of a plot which is familiar to Malayalam cinema by then. For example, Love in Kerala, which also starred. So basically, the detective officer is Prem Nazir. So it was same. So Prem Nazir and Jain as the two brothers who have to deal with crime in Singapore in their own ways. Love in Singapore again shows the foreign to be a location of thrills and adventure. the foreign location in these films is a place of crime as well as romantic relations, which do not involve the pedigrees of characters. Iniangilum, which was shot partially in Tokyo. So the plot is that a group of performers who have left for Tokyo are stranded there when their host disappears. This film too presents the foreign location as a place of high rises, glistening cars, high density of vehicular traffic, place of shootouts and thrills, chases, etc. Now, the affinity of the photograph with these movies of thrills and adventure is hard to miss. The handshakes between strangers are a staple of these films. When new associations are made in the city, whether for nefarious reasons or for the noble reason of fighting the bad guys, this is how interested parties meet, with hands stretched out as if in a business meeting. The shaking of hands with stretched out arms suggests a different association, one which is urban and therefore obviously modern. It is very different from greetings which do not touch each other or those which involve bodies which are in closer proximity to each other. The shaking of hands is when people meet in a city, for there are things to be done, deals to be fixed. These are men on a mission. Listen to the picture and you can even hear English. How do you do? The two people we see in the picture are, as we might have expected by now, quite known to each other. They are, in fact, flatmates. And so is the one who is taking the photograph. The three of them have set out one Friday, being a holiday, to photograph themselves against the wonders of the new place that they are now in. What we have in the photograph is an instance of imposturing, as Christopher Pinney would put it. It is one of those instances when the photograph is relieved of its task to be an indexical document and is made to picture a fantastic situation. In a study of transnational imagination in action cinema, Megan Morris has observed regarding action cinema, which is that the pitch of these films is broadly to a mobile and self-selecting community rather than state-based modes of effective mobilization. So this she's making this comment about what she calls the minor mode of action cinema, which is action cinema which is not produced by the big Western Europe or US-based studios, but by the small studios elsewhere in the world. This photograph, whose debt to transnational action cinema I have indicated, is the staging of this self-selection of a community. In the faint encounter that is the handshake in the photograph, the migrant conjures the meeting of two people, an affiliation that now strives to go beyond filiation, even as filiation plays a major role in the in the migration process, because most of the migration was kinship based. The close friends, who are also flatmates, become strangers in the photograph. The elder sibling who photographs this becomes invisible. The personal is sundered for it to be open to receive the affinities and affiliations that the world can bring. These are quite meaningless photos, which thereby brings their meaninglessness to the fore. These are acts of mimicry. So what does this performativity, this excess do? If anything, the interocularity of this photograph with the action cinema, it serves to construct the Gulf as a place which is like Manhattan. When photograph becomes a still from an unfolding action, the being there, the place of the action in its continuous present tense is an evolving possibility rather than the given of a there then, which is how a lot of photographs used to be read, which is that, photographs are documents of what happened at one place at one time. The migrant labor thus constructs the city in their leisure as much as in their labor. The Gulf becomes the terra nova of new relations, new settlements, new possibilities, new futures. What is evident in these photographs is the capacity to aspire, where the aspiration is fashioned by the possibilities obtained in a given historical situation. The migrant's body was his potential, and as much as this might be a precarious state to be in, it was still a possibility to be free from the deterrence of a traditional society that makes some bodies disqualified bodies. The body with traces of history is left behind for a body for which to shed one's skin for another is in its very nature. Impersonation becomes a migrant reality as much as it is a photographic reordering. This photograph is hardly even personal. It partakes of a language which belongs to the public sphere of the cinema hall. Ordered thus, it brings in the public it brings in the public to the personal. It stages the personal as public, operative in public knowledge. The performativity, the very nature of its excess, gives its reader a privileged access as the one who is capable of reading and interpreting the situation. In the photograph, we apprehend the noirish scantiness of an evening of new deals. The camera is placed at a high angle. This is a shot which is not supposed to foster identification with the characters. The high angle of the shot suggests conveying objective and authoritative knowledge. Even as the meeting of two strangers is staged, it is staged as if it is a clandestine affair. The meeting is away from the public eyes. In this, the camera frees itself from the artist and reenacts the transparent medium that it is supposed to be. And the migrant manipulates this transparent being of the camera to reveal a secret, one that shares its grammar with the glamour of cinema and its space with the glitz of the wondrous urbanity. The noirish sparseness of the location gives it an edgy freeze. One is standing at the tip of an action about to unfold. The photograph is the staging of a pleasure, that of belonging to the new world, but one that is articulated in the thrill of a secret. It is the disavowed display of of a private world, like cinema. In its very staging, it seeks transparency. The gaze of the camera intersects with that of the viewer of the photograph. Now, though it is the revealing of a secret, the moment you enter into the grammar of the action cinema, now the camera threatens to slip away from a position of neutrality. There is an intimation of a gaze involved, as if someone is looking, someone not seen by those in the picture. The objective view of the camera suddenly turns into a subjective view. We feel another body. But because the gaze of that third person coincides with our own, we are turned into a voyeur, existing within the diegetic space of the photograph. The chill and thrill now is because of an intimate foreboding that this body, whose vision I share, might be up to something I do not approve of. We are now beside ourselves, both ourselves and not ourselves, existing within and without. The pleasure of the photograph is in communicating stealthily of a third gaze, and in that frozen moment, the viewer, if in the know, decides whether to occupy that third gaze or not. That is to say, the photograph, while an indexical medium, is also in its performativity a calling out to the subject in the know. In the interocularity with the transnational action film, it calls forth the subject who is instantly presented a place within. This is an invitation if only one knows it. It is the excess itself which serves to produce a distinction and thereby produce a knowing subject, the citizen, one who is able to read beyond one's confines, the one who can be beside oneself. It is this intimacy whose basis is the indulgence in a public speech, this possibility of belonging as an excess that the girl invites you to. This performativity is also the carving out of a seemingly transparent medium such as photograph, an enjoyment available only to some. The lure of the Gulf is also the chance to partake in this community of enjoyment. To belong to a community of Gulf migrants, then, is to belong to it, is to belong to it in this order of personal distinction as an excess that one can feel about oneself. To belong to a community of migrants is to begin to experience the world as a personal invitation and a distinct experience. The lure of the Gulf is the lure to be beside oneself. The invitation is one to enjoy being uncertain of what the body whose vision we share is up to experience the world ironically. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Professor K. Ganesh.
Let the questions be asked. I'll comment. I have a few comments. I'll make it towards the end. Let the
No
questions
questions
come
are
to the
found
chat
on the
box.
chat
Yeah,
box
I
yet.
think there are a few. Yeah,
No questions are found on the chat box
there
yet.
is one. I see. There's no.
It's not a question, sir.
It's your
That was
turn. Your
typed by
question. Yeah.
myself.
Till wait for 1 or 2 minutes and then, yeah, there is.
Okay, there's a question by Abi Abraham. How about the materiality of the images? How do they keep it? Can you comment on that?
Should I wait for the questions or should I? Maybe I should just answer. So, right?
You can answer this one, Shafiq.
Yeah. So, I mean, good question. One of the things about these photographs is that, I mean, rather than being displayed very conspicuously in their houses, these photographs are now usually kept in forgotten albums in some corner of the house, in some suitcase. When I was doing my work on these photographs, I usually had to ask people to bring out these photographs. So basically, this actually tells us two things. One, that the photographs is not relevant anymore. But two, the very fact that it is irrelevant is kind of an acknowledgement of its of the I mean, the irrelevance can come because of the success of it, in the sense that this is not an archive which is to be excavated, but the very fact that it is all over the place, that it does not even need to be acknowledged. So, which basically means that it has been quite successful as an archive. So these photographs, I mean, their colors are running out. These are photographs which are stuck to the albums. Usually, what used to happen is that Gulf person brings cameras, they take photographs here. They also have cameras there. They have take photographs there. The people here, they take photographs. Then the negatives were developed in the Gulf usually because it was much cheaper. And when the negatives are developed there, the people there also add their own photographs. And when the albums are sent here, usually because it's bulky, usually the migrants themselves used to carry it now. But I mean, because of decades of neglect, if one is to say like that, these are in these exist, but in terms of its material, they are quite in a precarious state. I have what I have done is to photograph these photographs, because usually they cannot be taken out of the albums. I mean, they would stick to the entire color would go. It has also to do with our humidity. So that is how basically it is. But see, that is the other thing, which is that, I mean, this materiality in itself should tell us something about the rumor-like situation of these photographs, because essentially, these are not photographs of, these are not indexical documents or documentation of life as it existed. It is to be read in that other register of, oh, supposedly. And I think that explains why, I mean, that also partially explains the, the condition of these photographs. I hope I have answered that question.
Shaya, is there anyone else?
No, sir. Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, I think I will intervene just to push the discussion along. That's all. There are too many people. I think I would have, stopped back. Hello, Professor Shafeeq, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Yeah. Not as a chairperson, but as a person who is interested in these things. That's all. One I'm making as a history student, and the other comment I am making as a person who has lived in Malappuram district for 16 years and talked to a lot of people who have been in the Gulf and got very interesting information from them. The first comment is regarding your thing about the border and the migration. So I think that one has to look at it slightly differently, because what you say about the neoliberal casualization, fragmentation, etc., is perfectly valid according to me. But regarding migrations, until about 1950s in India, I think the migrations were not taking place. To and fro kind of migrations were rare. I mean, there were a few to and fro kind of migrations, but people who are going to Sri Lanka were actually brought there and made to settle as tea garden laborers, Assamese laborers. West Indies, there have been people who have migrated. And we have got evidence about South African migrations from Cochin and areas like that, in which these migrants never came back. In the sense that, the border never existed, primarily because of the fact that they just, as far as the Kerala people are concerned, they just disappeared. They might have become somebody else, and they might have come back later on, as there have been stories about some people coming later on, but that is all very, very few stories. Very, very vague kind of references also. But only after 1950s that we have got this to and fro kind of migrations taking place. And your reference to kafala system is very interesting, primarily because it is a kind of replacement. Earlier, the colonialism practiced slavery properly, or labor in the sense of actually in situ labor who are not been allowed to go out. But now you have got a situation where people are being allowed to go out, but who are denied, basic civil rights of people who were. So there is a difference like that. That I think is very important for understanding the question of border in the present tense, because in 19th century, if you know, I think there's in this Walscott's Raj Quartet, his series of novels, which has actually talked about English representation of Indian context. And there we have got another concept of border of a colony. Colony becomes a border then. And colony becomes a border for the metropolis, and the metropolis actually acts upon the colony, and the colony acts back upon the metropolis, as you said, translation. You can probably put Rabindranath Tagore's Gora as a kind of translation. Anyway, that is, I'm leaving it to you. So that is one thing. That is one thing which I think important, because this concept of border and the references to border, definitions of border, changes across history, and that has to be taken into account. There, I think your point about neoliberalism and its impact is very important. Second thing, I got a problem regarding translation. That is where I am giving him my own experience. I don't know whether he'll put it as a third case or something. That is left to you. See, I have talked to, as I said, a number of people who have come back from the Gulf. Now, the interesting point which I found was that the people who have, when there as laborers, migrant labor, as you said, I'm not talking about Najib's. I've not met anybody who had the same experience as Najib. So Najib is, I think, probably a fiction of Benjamin. I'm leaving it to him. I've not met anybody who has got the same experience as Najib. I've not heard anybody talking about it also. But the point is that I'm just quoting two instances. One is about a betel farmer near, he's a betel farmer now. He's a betel farmer now. He is about 70 years old or something, 60 to 70 years old. His son, now he's pretty old, and his son is actually running the betel farm. And he went to the Gulf in the 1960s in the famous, launch, the film Gafur Ka Dost kind of a launch, He went there as a launch. He actually was made to, that is why the film struck me also. He actually was made to, jump into the sea and swim across. This is something which happened to him also. The old man told me that, and he was laughing when he talked about Gafur Ka Dost. He is actually impersonating me, you see. So that point, this particular person actually made nothing as he was able to make a livelihood as a laborer. He came back with enough to actually get a betel farm originally on lease. And later he did, once this, Patayam and those kinds of things happened, he was, the betel farm was given to him finally as a settle. The betel farm was settled on him. And now he's making a livelihood as a betel farmer. He made nothing. He made nothing in the sense that he made enough to make something on lease. But there is another person whom also met. He is a person who actually was a tailor who went to Gulf, made money. I don't know how. That's left to him. He never told me how he made money. But he has built a house. He has built a house with a swimming pool in it. Substantially large building. With his children are all well set. But the difference between the first betel farmer and the second one is that from the point of view of an ordinary Malappuram person, this betel farmer is part of their community. Betel farmer is actually a political worker. He is actually a person who, he is there in all the committees, their Mahalla committee, this committee, that committee, everything, everywhere he is there. But the other man is totally outside. Nobody talks to him. Nobody even visits his house except his very close friends. And he doesn't make any communication with others. So there are two kinds of Gulf men working, actually living in the same Malappuram district, coming back from the Gulf. I don't know, how do you put this? This is not a photograph. This is with somebody two people whom I met. Probably it is my third case, possibly. So this is something which are good. So there are various ways of looking at the border. From the, people are gone and come back. I think that has also to be looked at. Instead of mere translation from a Kerala to the border, a Gulf person and the other thing, these kinds of differentiation within the people who have gone to the border and the Gulf and come back is something that is very interesting. That is what I thought, because that is where, apart from photographs and films, you've got something else that is happening in Kerala itself, where we talk to people. I don't know how will you look at it, but this is my second comment.
Thank you for the comments.
My name is Ganesh.
Yes, sir. So like as you rightly said, in the sense that like during the indentured labor, like abolition of slavery followed by indentured labor, to 1989, let's say, we have, see, it's not about what are the real kind of border crossings that are happening, but also how do we represent the border crossing. And my my contention, my argument is that we have been stuck with that diaspora moment for a long time, in the sense that our particular expression of migration has been that of absolute discontinuity, and therefore I'm in 100% agreement that essentially what we have to look at are people who keep coming back and going back and coming back, which basically after 1989, yes, there is some kind of academic recognition that migration need not always be about assimilation, integration, alienation, because these are old world concepts, but rather in this very neoliberal time in which people are constantly, everyone, for studies you have to migrate, for job you have to migrate, people are turned into migrants for most of their lives. So basically this book starting point is to recognize that we have to move away from, what I found a little difficult was that in spite of this 50 years of people going and coming back, our literature when it comes to migration is still about still in that frame of losing one's homeland and alienation, and not alienation in the foreign land, forgetting completely the kind of network which exists between Kerala and the Gulf. Like this entire individualistic notion of migration in which one person, one body goes to a complete foreign land, is opposed to the real ways in which, even in Benjamin, at the end, it's like the network of migrants which helped him get out. That network, we haven't had the vocabulary to speak about the network of migration. And it is actually, in a way, I am looking at that network in a discursive register of rumor. Because rumor would be one way in which this network can be mapped onto a literary topos. So obviously, I am looking at, in the book, of course, it has quite a lot of anecdotes, but again, it has this, it has these stories, or it has these incidents which I have heard of, rather than attributing it to an individual, because of I know there are technical reasons too for that, but also because these are, see, uh, there is also the other issue that we are people who grew up in the same, like in the sense that, as opposed to an anthropologist's notebook in which there will be a specific date entry in which that person has heard something. These are things which we have been hearing for 40 years. I've been hearing for 40 years. And obviously, it comes out of that sensibility, out of all these different stories that one sees and one hears around. Like, in fact, one of my starting points, one of the things which had fascinated me long back is that we had this neighbor who grew immensely rich suddenly, big house and all of that, and everyone in the village spoke about this guy getting a treasure. While it has been, that is the other thing, while all the Gulf people also knew that this guy got compensation as the place that he was working was attacked during the first Gulf War. So in the same village, you have two different kinds of epistemology to understand how a person gets rich. So it is this contrasting, struggling kind of epistemology that I wanted to use to understand something like a borderland, in the sense that why is there so much of insecurity built into this migration project? It is not, I mean, otherwise people just leave, right? I mean, they just leave not to ever come back. Why is there so much of insecurity in a system in which people keep coming back? It is structural. It is basically the discursive counterpart of a structural condition. And that condition is essentially a condition in which there is, and this is the dark part of the book, there is a lack of trust. There is all kinds of possibility of cheating, all kinds of possibility of building, preying on others. And this is precisely because of the ordering of the economy. So, so translation in the sense that both, but sir raised a very relevant point, in the sense that maybe one should also look at the distinction between migrants within Kerala. I mean, how does one migrant consider himself different from others? While, the book looks at communal pleasures, not really individual pleasures in the migration process. So yeah, that would be the, I mean, that is, but it's actually a very relevant point, that one also has to look at this sense of individual distinction and individual pleasure that comes with the Gulf migration. Yes, thank you.
Next question by Priyanka. There was a statement in one of the slides that said, migrant is complicit in the system. Can you expand on how compliancy works in case of a migrant?
So essentially, I mean, thank you for the question. Essentially, basically, I mean, the natives are very few in number. If you look at all the migrant literature, I mean, before RDG, maybe, the person who is oppressing you is not really an Arab. I mean, even if he's an Arab, he's an Arab from Egypt. In the sense that everyone who is oppressing you, everyone who is taking advantage of you, who is shortchanging you, is actually another migrant. This entire system operates through how you take advantage of the precarity of the migrant. Now, it is another question whether the migrant actually sees it as taking advantage, or even if it is taking advantage, whether the migrant sees a further advantage in allowing oneself to be taken advantage of. That is a different question. But if you look at this system, this entire system is basically, um, established migrants who are in a position, using that position to exploit other migrants. That is how the system works. That is the complicity. And I mean, this is like an everyday experience. Yes.
Okay,
So
thank you. Next. The next question by Soumya Sajan. Can you please explain the migrant subjectivity in the context translation or in between?
Now, here the in between, one has to first of all differentiate this kind of in between from the very common diaspora in between, which is that our in between here is not the in between of two nation states, like, their culture, our culture, I am caught in between. That is not the kind of question that we are looking at. We are looking at a very specific question, which is that because Gulf was highly lucrative in Kerala, which is that, I mean, if you look at the 80s, like the Gulf person is the ideal type. but also it came with its own precarity. There is a double, there's a double requirement on the person of the migrant. This is the in between. What is the double requirement? One is to preserve the distinction that comes with the Gulf. This distinction, which allows the Gulf person to impersonate many traditional roles in the village or back home, with the need to translate his precarity to a universal condition. The usual condition in which, everyone thinks I have a lot of money just because I'm in the Gulf, but I am also a worker like you. These are actually quite oppositional kind of requirements, because, the Gulf entitles you to many things. But at the same time, the Gulf is a temporary thing. The Gulf, it can very well be like the beetle farmer that Ganesh sir was speaking about. So you have this need to, one, translate respectability, money earned elsewhere, or, life lived elsewhere, into the domains of respectability in your place, while also promoting another register in which, both of these registers operate, right? And mostly it is the other register which operates, which is the second one, which is that, the fact that this is labor, this is just this is a global condition. This is that translation. So on the one hand, there is a need to fight against these borders, these cognitive borders, these epistemic borders, which is why every Gulf narrative seem to be speaking about revealing the real Gulf. But at the same time, it is not as if the Gulf was unknown to any person, in the sense that right from the beginning we knew that it is very difficult. So many people died, uh, as they swam across this, like swam in the sea. That did not stop their very close relatives from trying the same paths. So this is the particular translation, this particular subjectivity, which is caught um, in this double requirement, which basically has to find zones of pleasure, of distinction, even as the person also has to reveal what the life is like in the Gulf.
No more questions are. Yes, next question by Renu. Could you please elaborate on your sources? Do they include materials in which the migrants self-represent, such as photographs, as well as materials that represent the migrants, such as literature and films? How could you methodologically differentiate these sources?
Okay, thank you for the question, Renu. When the photographs that I'm looking at, as well as the literary pieces that I'm looking at, all of them are by people who are or have been in the Gulf, and are writing about the Gulf. The difference is when it comes to cinema, but there is an explanation for that difference, which is in the sense that when it comes to that film chapter, I am looking at mainstream Malayalam cinema, but it is also to establish that, it has already been established that as far as mainstream Malayalam cinema is concerned, from the 1980s, a major source of its funding comes from the Gulf. A major source of its audience is situated in the Gulf. So, considering that cinema is not really an individual medium of expression, but is a collective medium of expression, In that particular chapter, I have looked at the ways to read Gulf, even though Gulf is absent in these films as a diegetic space. How to read the Gulf, which anyway operates within the grammar of the cinema, in order to make it meaningful, even though the Gulf does not refer to the Gulf, or even though the films do not refer to the Gulf. So that has been the slight it's not really an anomaly once you have these explanations, but otherwise it has always been, I mean, all the primary materials, photographs, literature, all of them have been the migrant self-representations.
No more questions in the chat box. Hope it's the time to wind up the program. Professor Ganesh, shall we wind up the program?
Can I intervene once more? Just to.
Oh.
It's a question of poking. Sorry.
Okay. Sure, sir.
I have a slight problem with your second part, which I remembered only when you mentioned about the films later. Just now. Which is that, I think the representations of Gulf in films, I mean, you correct me if I am wrong. I'm not an expert in films or anything. Gulf in films are very different from the type of films you showed, like Edangadalinakkare and Akkaranunnoru and America and things like that. Well, basically, from a point of view of the Malayalis, Gulf is a place where you find to make your livelihood. And America is a fantasy land. It is not where some place where you make your livelihood. Only very recently, just yesterday, day before, I saw a small script from M.T. Vasudevan Nair. I think you might have seen in the series called Manorathangal. There is a film by Mahesh Narayanan, which included Fahad Fasil and Nadia Moidu, if I remember correctly, where the American migrant was actually shown. Which is one of the rare cases in which an American migrant, a person who migrates to America, is shown not as belonging to a fantasy land. Otherwise, this question of fantasization of America is something that is very different from that of Gulf. I think these two things cannot be mixed together in the form of imaging alone. And that is, I think, one problem which I found regarding the later part.
So, sir, I completely agree with the fact that the films have shown Gulf as a realist space of labor.
Yeah.
It begins at unemployed people, not bunk beds, like halls, so much difficulty, all of it. But what am I saying? I am saying that if you look at these photographs, they are actually changing the register of that Gulf. So actually, the photograph is mixing the register. Even when films imagine Gulf as this realist space, so after 1980, it's like we have to wait for quite some long time, almost 2 decades, some 17 years before Gulf is shown again in Malayalam cinema. But throughout that period, Gulf is referred to, and in that reference, the Gulf takes another form. Now, my purpose with the photograph is to say the opposite thing, which is that, see, the Gulf is a really space of labor, not just in cinema, in academic, in migrant literature, but look at this migrant self-expression. It changes the reference point of representing Gulf itself, because they are imagining it as if it is America, while it is not America in realist fiction, in films, in realist prose, in migrant memoirs, autobiographies. It is all very difficult. But look at the photographs. That is not what we see here, which is basically the other register, in the sense that people could also imagine other possibilities in the Gulf. So that was the issue. I mean, that is what the twist that I wanted to bring there.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shafeeq. Now, We are towards the end of the program. Thank you, Professor K. N. Ganesh, for chairing the session. Thank you, Dr. Mohamed Shafeeq, for being part of our webinar. Thank you for the participants for actively taking part in the program. And finally, thank you for the entire KCHR team for supporting me during the coordination of the event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you.
There is an announcement regarding our next webinar, which is scheduled to be held on 29th of this month by Dr. Abbas Panakal, who is a historian at the School of History, University of St. Andrews, UK, on the topic, Decolonial Historiography of Malabar Resistance. All are invited. Thank you.